Come in, my good folks. You have come up from BookTube, I see. Well, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for justice with a look at Arthur Conan Doyle's 7th Sherlock Holmes story and his 5th Sherlock Holmes short story, The Five Orange Pips, first published in the November 1891 issue of the Strand magazine. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but Scotty, isn't Holmes is Where the Heart Is, the now annual and very popular BookTube event created by Jim at Mystery and Mayhem that encourages us all to be reading Sherlock Holmes fiction, over with for a whole other year? Well, yes, it is. But I mentioned last time, in the last Sherlock Holmes video that I did, that I didn't think I was going to be able to wait a whole year to do another Sherlock Holmes video. So I was looking for an excuse, and then it just suddenly dawned on me a couple of days ago that, wait a minute, this is March. The whole month is March Mystery Madness, which is another BookTube event, now in its 10th year, that was created by Lizzie Fay Loves Books and Troy Towell to get us to be reading mystery fiction. Well, certainly Sherlock Holmes falls under that category. So this is my offering now for another Sherlock Holmes video for March Mystery Madness. And I'll leave a link to Lizzie Fay Loves Books and Troy Towell's announcement videos for this year's edition of March Mystery Madness. I'll leave those links down in the description notes down below. And I will also leave a link down below to, I might as well promote my own videos here. I have been doing Sherlock Holmes videos for Holmes is Where the Heart Is now the last couple of years. And so far there are 6 of those. And I put them in order. I'm trying to get these all to kind of stand alone, but I put them all in order in the playlist that they were written in by Arthur Conan Doyle. So if you want to start from the beginning and catch up to this video here, you can check out the playlist down below. Or if you've seen them already or just don't care to go through that exercise, that's fine. I'll try to get this one to stand alone as well. So to start off with, like I usually do, we'll do a little catch up here with Dr. Conan Doyle and see what brought him up from the previous video, which was about the Boscombe Valley mystery, now up to the 5 Orange Pips. And then after that, then we'll chat a little bit about the story itself. And then, as usual, we'll wrap up with looking at the Sidney Paget illustrations. Sidney Paget was the premier illustrator for the Strand magazine on the Sherlock Holmes stories. And we'll end up with that. So, but first, like I say, let's catch up with Dr. Doyle. So in early 1891, Conan Doyle was studying ophthalmology in Vienna. And that's where he came up with the idea of creating a series of short stories based on a central character that he could sell to a magazine, that instead of writing a novel that would be serialized over a period of months, each month would tell a story based on that central character, but as individual stories month by month, rather than a continued serialization of a novel. And so he thought he could take his character Sherlock Holmes, that he'd already written 2 novels about, and build on that. He knew the characters already pretty well and kind of had the hang of Holmes's style and technique, all of that kind of thing. And so after his studies in Vienna, he and his wife Tui moved to London, where he could open up a new ophthalmology practice. But he was still trying to sell that idea of the Sherlock Holmes series. He had written the first short story before leaving Vienna, A Scandal in Bohemia, which took his experiences in Vienna and kind of cooked that into his plot line for that story. Now, by March of 1891, he had sold the idea to the Strand magazine of carrying 6 Sherlock Holmes stories, each one self-contained short story that would start to be published in July, with the July 1891 issue. And by the end of April, after he had sold that idea to the Strand, he cranked out no less than 3 more Sherlock Holmes short stories, taking about a week or 2 to write each one. But after he delivered that fourth story, the Boscombe Valley Mystery, to his agent and then to the Strand magazine, Conan Doyle disappeared. During that month of April, Doyle was getting sicker and sicker until it finally developed into a serious case of pneumonia. And it was the same strain of pneumonia that had killed his sister Annette 3 years earlier. So Doyle kind of had this idea that he may be facing his own demise. He wound up becoming completely bedridden for weeks and weeks. And he wasn't able to manage his new medical practice or to write at all during that time. But fortunately, thanks to some new copyright laws in the United States, the Strand magazine had agreed not to start running any of the new Sherlock Holmes stories until the July issue. And so that the fact that Doyle had written so many stories, he had 4 of them done by the end of April, that bought him some time now. And finally, by July, just as A Scandal in Bohemia was first running in that month's Strand magazine, Doyle had begun to recover enough to start writing the 5th in the series, The 5 Orange Pips, and deliver the manuscript to the Strand. Now, this story was a lot shorter than the Holmes short stories that Doyle had written up until now. Those usually came in around 15 or 16 pages, and The 5 Orange Pips was coming in at only 11 pages. And I wonder if that was due to the fact that he was only just then recovering from such an illness, and then maybe he was taking some shortcuts just in order to catch up and deliver another manuscript to the Strand that everyone was worried was going to come in late. But at any rate, during that time, he was once again, I think, dipping into his catalog of historical adventure stories to kind of build this new Sherlock Holmes story around. He'd already done that a few times. That was his favorite genre, was historical fiction, historical adventures. That's what he really preferred writing, but Sherlock Holmes was kind of more of a paycheck in his mind. So he would kind of build a lot of the mysteries around the types of stories that he preferred to be writing. And he had done this, like I say, a few times before. So with his very first novel, Sherlock Holmes story, Study in Scarlet, he had the backstory of the mystery in that book set in the old American West in the 1840s and 50s around the founding of the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City. And then again in The Sign of the Four, his second novel was set in the 1850s, or I guess I should say the backdrop of the mystery was set in the 1850s during the Sepoy Mutiny in India, the British Army. And then just more recently here in the Boscombe Valley Mystery, he set that in the Victoria Gold Rush in Australia in the 1850s and 60s, I think. That was the backstory of the mystery in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. And now Doyle is going to use the background of the Civil War, starting with the Battle of Nashville and then Reconstruction for the 5 Orange Pips. And it involves a series of threats and murders orchestrated by members of the Ku Klux Klan against a former colonel in the Confederate Army and his heirs. Now, at this point, I should issue a spoiler alert because I'm going to be chatting about the story itself, and then when we get into the illustrations by Sidney Paget, those illustrate certain points along through the story, and we'll have to kind of talk about some of that stuff in order to discuss the illustration. So if you haven't read the 5 Orange Pips yet, or you're not familiar with it, I might suggest that you pause the video right now, go read the story, and like I say, it's the shortest Sherlock Holmes story written yet. So it will probably take you a half hour or less, maybe, and then come on back and join us. If you are familiar with the 5 Orange Pips, have already read it, or you don't care about spoilers, then just sit tight and we'll get back to it here in just a moment. And we're back. So as I was saying, I just get the feeling that Doyle was kind of rushing through writing the 5 Orange Pips, and not really out of lack of quality, really, but again, I think he was just hurrying up to get a manuscript to the editors of the Strand magazine after so many weeks and weeks and just get the ball rolling again. Still regaining his strength. But also the story itself is just less complex. Like I said, it's a shorter story, and there's not the complexity that we're used to seeing. And in fact, the ending of it, which I'm not going to get, this is a spoiler I'm trying to avoid, but the ending of it is just kind of out of Holmes's hands, really, rather than his total involvement in that. But even that shortcut is a kind of a cool way of ending the story. It's very satisfying, actually. But the story almost wants to start off with, "It was a dark and stormy night." That old chestnut there. And in fact, Doyle even uses the phrase, and I'll just read a quote here somewhere towards the end of the story, but it says, "The night, however, was extremely dark and stormy, so that in spite of the help of several passers-by, it was quite impossible to effect a rescue." So it was a dark and stormy night in Baker Street, and the story starts off with the rain pounding on the windows and the wind howling down through the chimney into 221B. So Holmes and Watson are just kind of taking it easy while the storm rages outside. Holmes is sitting around. I think what is he doing? He's kind of cataloging his case file, index files or something. And Watson is sitting back enjoying A Sea Adventure by Charles Russell. And I wonder if that was a nod to the types of stories that Doyle himself liked to read and also to write. But because of the storm outside and just the sounds that it's making, moaning through the windowsills and through the chimney and the rain pounding, all that going on, as Watson is reading The Sea Adventure, he is lost in the story and listening to all the sound effects going on from the storm outside, enhancing his reading. And so that was a little passage there that I appreciated, because I myself remember reading an old Ray Bradbury story. It was set on Venus, where it was just constantly raining and raining, eternally raining. And that was the background of the story. And I was reading it. I was in high school at the time, and we were having a particularly rainy winter as I was reading that. And the wind was, and the rain and everything was pounding on my own windowsills as I was reading that story in my bedroom. And that experience has always stuck with me. And so here is Watson having the same kind of experience. But interesting here that Watson explains that he is staying with Holmes for a while. He's not a roommate at this point, but his wife is out of town visiting her aunt or something. And so he is taking her absence as a chance to go and hang out with Holmes in his old digs. Now, if you've been reading the stories in order in the Strand magazine, as the readers were doing in those days, you would, as a casual reader, assume that he's talking about his wife, Mary Morstan, who he met and married in The Sign of the Four, which was set in 1888. However, we are told in this story, The Five Orange Pips, that it takes place in 1887. So this lends some credence to a lot of the Sherlockian scholars who have had to assume and assert that Mary Morstan was actually Watson's second wife, although never explained that way in the canon. But it does make sense if you read it that way. It doesn't matter to the story, but it's just kind of an interesting point. But anyway, as I say, the story starts off on this howling, rainy, windy night. And as Watson is reading, he hears the bell downstairs and asks Holmes if he was expecting a client. And Holmes says something like, if it is a client, I'm not expecting anyone, but if it is a client, it must be a pretty severe case, because no one would come out on a night like this and at this hour unless they were very desperate. It's probably just one of Mrs. Hudson's cronies coming for a visit, and lets it go at that. But that reminded me of a scene from an old movie, 1970, Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. And there's a scene in there where it's evening. It's not dark and stormy out, but Holmes is relaxing one night on the fainting couch playing the violin, and Watson is looking down or through the window down at Baker Street, and he sees a cab pull up in front of 221B, and someone hops out of the cab and moves towards the door. And so he asks Holmes, are you expecting anybody? And Holmes says, no. And so Watson says, well, maybe Mrs. Hudson is entertaining. And Holmes says, I've never found her so. So if you've never seen The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, I heartily recommend it if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan. It's a bit of a send-up, but it's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of Easter eggs for Holmes fans throughout the movie. So if you get a chance to see it, if you haven't already, check it out. And I guess that's enough discussion of the story itself here, because we're going to be talking about more of it as we go through the illustrations coming up here now. And as I mentioned before, The Five Orange Pips is a lot shorter than the other stories so far. And so there are only 6 Paget illustrations this time instead of the usual 9 or 10. So, and we will be discussing those scenes as we go through. So once again, I want to give you that spoiler alert. If you haven't read the story, or you're not familiar with it, and you don't want to know any particular story points, go read the story. It won't take very long. And then come back and join us for these 6 Paget illustrations. All right, that's better. Now, the first illustration here, we are introduced to John Openshaw, who is our client. And as soon as he steps through the door, Holmes immediately identifies him as someone from the southwest of England because of the unique mixture of clay and chalk that he sees on his boots, which, of course, astounds Openshaw, and he confirms it by saying that he is from Horsham and has come for advice and help. And Paget, as usual, delivers a nice portraiture of Openshaw here based on the description in Doyle's text, which includes he is a young man of 22, well-groomed and trimly clad, with something of refinement and delicacy in his bearing. And of course, he's dressed for the severe weather outside, so when he comes in, he's just dripping puddles onto Mrs. Hudson's floor. But unfortunately, although we don't know it yet at this point in the story, and we won't get into it here, but he's going to be getting a whole lot wetter by the end of the story. And so Openshaw explains that he's come to Holmes for a number of reasons, but one in particular, that he's heard that Holmes is never beaten. And Holmes corrects him right away. He says, I have been beaten 4 times, 3 times by men and once by a woman. And if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, you will likely assume that he's talking about Irene Adler from A Scandal in Bohemia. And that's probably right, because Doyle would often make references to characters and events in earlier stories, trying to cross-sell them so that someone reading this particular story will be curious and maybe want to go and buy and read the earlier stories, and then Doyle would be getting a few extra paychecks that way. And then, as part of his case that he's explaining to Holmes, he talks about his uncle, Colonel Elias Openshaw of the Confederate Army, and his involvement at the Battle of Nashville. And how after Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union Army, the colonel retired back to his plantation in Florida, and some years after that, he moved back to England and settled in Horsham with all the money that his plantation had made him. And then one day, several years later, he receives an envelope with a postmark from Pondicherry, India. And he opens that up at breakfast, and out fall 5 dried orange pips, and inside the flap is signed in red ink, KKK. And he doesn't explain any of this, of course, but it scares the hell out of him for some reason. And he goes running upstairs into this room he keeps locked up in the attic, and starts to burn some papers. And after that, he started drinking a lot more than usual. He was already a pretty heavy drinker, and he was often seen running around in all kinds of weather out in the garden at the estate there, and kind of yelling things that nobody understood into the trees and shrubberies. But then 7 weeks later, his body was found face down in a shallow pool of water in the garden. No sign of violence, so the investigation deemed it a suicide. But young John Openshaw, knowing his uncle as well as he did not believe that it was a suicide. And even if it was, what a way to commit suicide by sticking your head in a shallow pool of water and drowning yourself. Made no sense to him at all. He just did not believe it. But after that, the estate then was inherited by young John Openshaw's father, Joseph Openshaw. And John Openshaw explains the story of the 5 orange pips and how then his uncle died mysteriously 7 weeks later and was concerned about that. And so his father, Joseph Openshaw, just kind of laughed that off. He didn't make any connection at all between the envelope with the orange pips and this mysterious death. He didn't believe that there was a connection there. Now, all that happened in 1884 sometime, and in January of 1885, which is about 2.5 years before the opening of the story, The 5 Orange Pips, Joseph Openshaw now has moved into the estate, and one day, just shortly after the new year, he receives a letter containing 5 dried orange pips and a note that reads, "Put the papers on the sundial." And again, it's signed in red ink, KKK. This time, the envelope is postmarked from Dundee. And Joseph Openshaw, like I said, he would always kind of poo-pooed John Openshaw's story about the connection here and about the 5 orange pips. But he's not laughing now. And he's asking, what papers? What are they talking about, these papers? Put what papers on the sundial? And now young John Openshaw is assuming that the papers for the sundial were the papers that his uncle must have burned that day after he received his orange pips in the mail. But then 3 days after that, his father, Joseph Openshaw, trying to keep track of our Openshaws here, Joseph Openshaw decides to visit a friend of his in Portsdown Hill for some reason. And so off he goes. And then a day after that, John Openshaw, still back at the estate, receives a telegram informing him that his father's body has been found dead, having fallen into a chalk pit. And again, no sign of foul play or anything, so the police are determining this death to just be from accidental causes. But that just seems too coincidental now to John Openshaw. He doesn't believe that. He sees a definite connection now between getting the 5 orange pips with the KKK and then a mysterious death. And to make matters worse now, he hasn't inherited the estate now. And that brings us to the next illustration where young John Openshaw now is continuing his narrative to Holmes, explaining the details of the case. And as he's standing there in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, he pulls out a crumpled envelope from his waistcoat and tells Holmes that he has received this just yesterday, and it's postmarked from East London. And so he opens up the envelope and he shakes out onto this table here 5 dried orange pips and shows the message from inside the envelope that says, "Put the papers on the sundial," and again with the letters KKK. And now, just to talk about the illustration here for a second, again we see Paget giving us a nice rendering of Openshaw, but he's now shed of his soaking overcoat and umbrella, and we can see him sporting his fine golden pince-nez spectacles there, which were described earlier in the story. And we also see him holding that envelope, the crumpled envelope, up to this cool oil lamp, which is probably just like one in Sidney Paget's studio. He often liked to use furnishings and objects in his surroundings to draw from. But getting back to the story now, Holmes is also convinced that there is a connection between all these orange pips and these mysterious deaths, and that they are, in fact, murder in both cases, especially since somehow John Openshaw has produced this sheet of paper that matches the color and texture of remnants of the papers that his uncle burned in that fireplace years ago. And there's writing on this one. So Holmes and Openshaw are assuming that this must have been a page from those papers that somehow survived the fire. So now Holmes is concerned, and he tells Openshaw to get back to Horsham immediately and take this surviving remaining page, put it on the sundial with a note that says the other pages of these papers were burned by his uncle years ago. And so Openshaw says, absolutely. And so he leaves Baker Street immediately to go rushing back to the estate and heads to the Waterloo train station to catch the next train out of town. And now in the fifth illustration of the six, and after Openshaw has left Baker Street, Sidney Paget is giving us this terrific image of a rather dapper Holmes, and he's staring into the fire at Baker Street there while he's contemplating the case. He and Watson chat for a little bit about how this case reminds them of the Sign of the Four, and this is another example of Doyle cross-selling his Holmes stories. And of course, we Sherlock Holmes fans, we love these little Easter eggs here. Now, Holmes has figured out that KKK must stand for the Ku Klux Klan. And in case readers, back when they were first reading this in 1891, weren't familiar with the Ku Klux Klan, Watson likewise isn't familiar with it. So Holmes explains it to Watson. Therefore, the readers will understand this macabre connection to the story here. But he's also reasoned that the postmarks have all come from port cities, one in India, then one in Dundee, and then now one from East London. So he's deducing that our bad guy or bad guys must be on a ship, and probably a sailing ship, because whatever envelopes they're mailing out by steamship are arriving at their destination before the sailing ship can get there, because the first murder took place 7 weeks after the pips were received in the mail. Then the next one happened 4 days after the envelope arrived from Dundee. And now that this last one came from East London, there's very little time left to act now. So they better be quick about it, but there's nothing they can do until morning now, or at least until this storm abates. And that brings us to the last illustration here, the next morning at breakfast. And the storm has passed, and Holmes is explaining his plans for the day. He's going to be looking into the case further, but he's got to act quick. But Watson is, while Holmes is eating breakfast, reading the newspaper and sees an article in there and tells Holmes that he's already too late. Now, John Openshaw's body has been found last night, that dark and stormy night before, just off the embankment near Waterloo Bridge, on his way to Waterloo Station to go home. Holmes is devastated by this news, and he blames himself for having sent Openshaw to his death the night before, and now he vows to track down the murderer if it's the last thing he does, so that his young client can be avenged. And now we're all out of illustration, so there's really no reason of explaining any more of the story than we already have. So if you want to know how justice is finally served by the end of the 5 Orange Pips, you'll just have to read it yourself. But I've already given you 2 chances to do that, haven't I? So you must have read it by now. Anyway, there you have it, folks. And that brings us to the end of the 5th of the original 6 commissioned Sherlock Holmes short stories that Doyle wrote. That leaves 1 more of the original 6 that I'd like to do a video for. And like last time, I don't feel like waiting until next February for the next Holmes is Where the Heart Is. So there is Spring into Adventure in April. So that will give me an excuse to do the 6th video here, and we'll hopefully get that up in the next few weeks. We'll see. Cross your fingers for me. But I guess I should say just before I go and before I forget that once again, like I did in my earlier Sherlock Holmes videos, I have once again stooped down to my Sherlockian nerdiness and created yet another Google map, this time pinpointing all the locations and things discussed in the story. So I will leave a link to the Google map in the description notes down below. So if you're interested in that again, check it out. And just to encourage some comments, let me know if you enjoyed the 5 Orange Pips, or if maybe you have another favorite Sherlock Holmes story or pastiche or what have you. Let's chat about Sherlock Holmes for a little bit more. And I guess until the next game is afoot, thanks a lot.